While nowhere near as many retcons were made to the EU with the original trilogy as later works, there were still retcons, and considering Star Wars was nowhere near the expansive universe in the 70s and 80s as it became later on, there was less excuse to justify Lucas not being in the know on these. Jabba the Hutt, as depicted in Return of the Jedi, is a completely different species than in the comic adaptation of A New Hope, and the future Marvel comics he appeared in prior to 1983. The comics were canon at the time. This led to a retcon to establish this depiction as a different character entirely. Anakin was named Tan Skywalker in the 1978 comic strips. Return of the Jedi later gave him the name Anakin Skywalker. And if you want to bring up the Marvel comics not being canon per se, we'll address that towards the end. The prologue in the novelization of Episode 4 established Palpatine as someone being controlled by various other bureaucrats. Keep in mind this is the out-of-universe prologue, not the in-universe character perspectives. This is at odds with the depiction of the Emperor we see in Episodes 5 and 6. If it was all canon, George should have ran with what was established, but he didn't, because he only considered his films canon. The special editions created further retcons. The way Jabba is depicted in the Jabba the Hutt comics is at odds with the special edition of A New Hope. Also, Yuzums, as depicted in Star Wars droids, vary heavily from their depiction in the special edition of Return of the Jedi. I pose the same question about George and canonicity, especially considering droids was a visual medium and not a random novel or comic, so that one should have been easy to avoid. However, as I said, the original trilogy is minimal. Let's move on to the prequel trilogy. A lot of EU purists like to defend the canonicity of the EU in George's eyes by pointing out various references and connections in the prequel films. But they can't have their cake and eat it too. George also retconned elements, sometimes in major ways, with the prequel trilogy. As a fun reminder, in the old continuity system, G-canon referred to the films, their novelizations and screenplays, and statements from George Lucas, hence why Mahdi was renamed Conan Antonio Mahdi. If anyone doubts me or the basic summary available online and on Wikipedia, a source is present to reference. Perhaps the biggest retcon would be the origin story of Boba Fett. In the EU, he had a couple of different backstories. One as a former stormtrooper, and also one that had revealed his original name as Jaster Muriel, and he was a journeyman protected from Concord Dumb. Attack of the Clones revealed Boba was actually a clone of Jango Fett. George has been on the record saying he references Star Wars encyclopedias, but I do try to keep it consistent. The way I do it now is they have a Star Wars encyclopedia, so if I come up with a name or something else, I look it up and see if it has already been used. He's also aware of Boba Fett having an expanded role in the EU, being aware of his survival, and even saying he contemplated adding a scene in the special edition of Boba Fett surviving the Sarlacc pit, having regretted the way they handled his death in Episode 6. But he decided against it and chose not to include it, thinking it might mess with the structure of the film. If George was aware of Boba's role in the EU and referenced encyclopedias, he should know the basics of Boba's backstory, or at least had thought to look into it. But either way, he didn't include it. Why? Because he didn't count the EU as part of his canon, which is why he was not beholden to it. If he did see it as part of his canon, he would have restrained himself to respect what was already established. Pre-Attack of the Clone sources have never stated, with one extremely minor exception from 1978, that clones were stormtroopers or that Boba Fett had any physical resemblance to the Old Republic soldiers or other stormtroopers. Lucas has stated otherwise. Lucas stated in the Attack of the Clones commentary, throughout, as we go through the movie, there's all little funny moments like Jango bumping his head, because in Star Wars, one of the stormtroopers bumps his head on the door as they leave the control room on the Death Star. And I thought, wouldn't it be funny if that's a trait that Jango has when he puts his helmet on and everything? He can't really see that well, and he's constantly bumping his head. And that trait gets cloned in all the stormtroopers, and that's why they keep bumping their heads. The original EU 90s stories had referenced the Clone Wars as having taken place about 30 to 40 years prior to the classic trilogy. They even made references to the clones being the bad guys that fought the Jedi. This trend began with Heir to the Empire. Attack of the Clones establishes the war has taken place about 2 decades before the classic trilogy instead. In the second novel of the Thrawn trilogy, it makes references to Sabaoth's past with the Jedi that are not reconcilable as written with the prequels. While later sources and stories attempted to fix this and justify it, this was not the original intent of the author. Either Lucas gave these dates to the EU team and changed his mind, or Timothy Zahn and other EU authors established these ideas and dates on their own, but either way, Lucas retconned it with the prequels. If he saw these as canon, he should have stuck with these dates. EU authors didn't really touch on the prequel era, so Lucas wouldn't have had much in the encyclopedia research to read up on prior to the new trilogy. Besides, one of the criticisms of the films when they came out was that the dates didn't feel like they lined up, whether it be Anakin and Obi-Wan's ages or the references to the Republic and Jedi being ancient. After all, per the current film's timeline, Sebastian Shaw, an elderly man, portrayed the Force ghost of Anakin Skywalker, who was canonically 46 years old at the time. Comparing Hayden Christensen at current age 44 to Sebastian Shaw as the original Anakin in Return of the Jedi is no contest, who at the time was 78 years old. But again, Lucas ignored all this. Further supporting this, the 1994 second edition guide to the Star Wars universe laid out an interesting timeline of canon events, such as Obi-Wan being born 3 years prior to when he now canonically was born, Anakin being born about 14 years earlier than Phantom Menace establishes, the Clone Wars ending about 16 years sooner than Revenge of the Sith establishes, the fall of the Republic happening prior to Luke and Leia's birth, and the events of the Revenge of the Sith, like Anakin's fall, the Jedi Purge, and the birth of the twins, a year after Revenge of the Sith establishes they happen, simultaneously establishing the Clone Wars as separate from the fall of the Republic. What's funny is Lucas said he read encyclopedias like this one to help keep things consistent, yet he retconned all of these events. Furthermore, the Return of the Jedi novel established Owen Lars as Obi-Wan's brother, and future EU material, including a Qui-Gon Obi-Wan story released after Phantom Menace, ran with this information as canon. Lucas would later retcon this in Attack of the Clones and make Owen Lars the stepbrother of Anakin Skywalker, with no relation to Kenobi and no contact with him prior to Revenge of the Sith. Regarding Mace Windu's lightsaber, in the EU pre-Attack of the Clones, Mace Windu had a blue lightsaber. His Phantom Menace action figure even included it, and the comics had him use it. And keep in mind, George supposedly read the comics. George gave Mace Windu a purple lightsaber. He should have stuck with the blue, that was already established, but he bended the rules. Why? Because he never activated his lightsaber in Phantom Menace, and the hilt he actually had was only visible in one blinker you'll miss it shot. Must be another one of those continuities for wimps things. Some might refute that as being retconned and fixed with him having two lightsabers, but again, I don't think George saw it that way. Speaking of lightsabers, though, in the pre-Attack of the Clones comics, Jedi had all sorts of lightsaber colors. But in the behind-the-scenes clip where Sam Jackson asks about a purple lightsaber color, George initially tells him Jedi only have blue or green lightsabers, and Sith only have red ones, despite the comics showing Jedi using red lightsabers. Whoops! The origin of the Death Star plans are different in the EU, originating with Sienar, versus what Attack of the Clones establishes with the Geonosians. Episode 4 establishes that C-3PO and R2-D2's master was Captain Antilles before Luke. Episode 3 places them in the care of Captain Antilles, even though droid shows them rotate through several masters, with no mention of Antilles or being separated. Ooh, let's talk about a doozy. Let's talk about the Sith. The novelization for the Phantom Menace, according to Terry Brooks, this came from George Lucas, establishes that the Sith splintered from the Jedi about 2,000 years prior to the films, but Tales of the Jedi establishes a way older Sith order. The Sith had come into being almost 2,000 years ago. Others were recruited, and soon the ranks of the Sith swelled to less than 50 in number. The Sith began to build their cult in opposition to the Jedi. Their war with the Jedi was vengeful and furious and ultimately doomed. The rogue Jedi who had founded the Sith Order was its nominal leader, but his ambition excluded any sharing of powder. His disciples began to conspire against him and each other almost from the beginning, so that the war they instigated was as much with each other as with the Jedi. In the end, the Sith destroyed themselves. They destroyed their leader first, then each other. What few survived the initial bloodbath were quickly dispatched by watchful Jedi. In a matter of only weeks, all of them died, all but one. George Lucas also stated that the Sith never had a war with the Jedi, and that the Sith merely fought themselves until their destruction, which led to the Rule of Two. This fundamentally goes against the EU. Everybody said, oh, well, there was a war between the Jedi and the Sith. Well, that never happened. That's just made up by fans or somebody. What really happened is the Sith ruled the universe for a while, 2,000 years ago. Each Sith has an apprentice, but the problem was each Sith Lord got to be powerful, and the Sith Lords would try to kill each other because they all wanted to be the most powerful. So in the end, they killed each other off, and there wasn't anything left. So the idea is that when you have a Sith Lord, and he has an apprentice, the apprentice is always trying to recruit somebody to join him, because he's not strong enough, usually, so that he can kill his master. That's why I call it a rule of two. There's only two Sith Lords. There can't be any more because they kill each other. They're not smart enough to realize that if they do that, they're going to wipe themselves out, which is exactly what they did. In The Phantom Menace, Palpatine was the one Sith Lord that was left standing. Which, that's an interesting note, because what about Plagueis? To Paul Duncan, he also stated, there was never a war between the Jedi and the Sith Lords. What happened when you have a world full of Sith Lords? They start killing each other to see who's going to be the top Sith Lord. Real quick, I want to note that recently it came to my attention from EU YouTube channel Iron Inquisitor that this last quote was actually from a 2003 memo included in the Star Wars archives, not from George's 2018 interview for the book. While I don't doubt him per se, at the time of scripting this, he hasn't uploaded his updated video he said he intends to make about the subject, and I don't have a copy of the book or a photocopy of the section, so I'm going to operate under the assumption that this was a 2018 era quote. Anyways, getting back to the point. If the EU was all canon, why would he reinforce these ideas years later? Shouldn't he accept there's a different story for the Sith now? Surely he knows some of the basics of one of the most popular games of the last few decades that came out of his company. Or maybe it's because he didn't see it as part of his canon. And as for the novelizations of The Phantom Menace, that seems to run contrary to what was established about the Sith and the Jedi in Tales of the Jedi, which came before the prequels. To elaborate further, I've seen some dismiss this due to the date as both recent George quotes from around 2019. Sure, in regards to dictating what can and can't be canon for the company, 2019 is too late for that. And I agree. But I'm not here arguing the EU wasn't canon to Lucasfilm or licensing. I'm arguing the EU wasn't canon to George. And if it wasn't, he wouldn't have made those statements or explicitly called the war between the Jedi and Sith something a fan or someone else made up and that they were all wrong. He clearly did not see all that as canon. I've also seen two quotes from Lucas to Star Wars Insider brought up to either frame Lucas as inconsistent or having changed his mind on the matter. The Sith are the arch-enemies of the Jedi, and for a long time they ruled the universe until the Jedi came along and got rid of them. As George Lucas describes it, the Sith were once in control of the galaxy 1,000 years in the past. Unfortunately, the Sith's hunger for conquest got the better of them. So many Sith Lords were vying for ultimate control that it led to infighting among their ranks. Such internecine struggles were exploited by the Jedi Knights of the era, and they were able to turn the tide and defeat the Sith. First off, I don't see Lucas as having changed his mind, as the Episode 1 novelization seems to fit this description of the Sith backstory as he described in 2019. As for the quotes, I would say the first was a quick, concise statement, and the second was an expansion. The Sith had infighting, and because of that, the Jedi were able to use that against the Sith, and the Sith lost control because they devoured themselves. In the Phantom Menace novel, it says the Sith started fighting themselves, and whoever survived got picked off by the Jedi. That doesn't necessarily mean a war. I know the novel mentions the word war, but in that context it seems more like a metaphorical or ideological war than a galaxy-spanning conflict, as it says they started building their cult in opposition to the Jedi, and then that is described as a war. Obviously there was probably violence, but not a full-scale war, and just because they are arch-enemies, it doesn't mean full-scale war. The Sith spawned from the Jedi. They were like yin and yang. That can make them enemies without having a galactic war. Case in point, one might say the two major political parties in the US, or higher-up elected officials in said parties, are arch-enemies, but that doesn't mean America is in a full-on war between both sides, even if some violence has broken out in minor areas. The conflict between two parties might still be called a war, but one in an ideological sense, not a boots-on-the-ground type. Some might ask then, what was the revenge Maul wanted in Phantom Menace? Well, the Sith had to live in hiding and out of power for 1,000 years because of the Jedi. And the Jedi did kill a few of their number. Seems like a valid enough reason to me. Also, key to note that some people bring up Darth Bane as a way of George's involvement in the EU, and that's not true. George created Darth Bane for the backstory of Episode 1 to be included in the novel, and the EU later ran with that. Running along these same lines, though, let's examine the Chosen One prophecy. Palpatine surviving in Dark Empire fundamentally undoes the Chosen One prophecy, as does the existence of other Sith in the EU post-Return of the Jedi. The prophecy was not part of the classic trilogy and did not need to be included in the prequels, but George did it anyway, and he surely knew about the Emperor's survival. EU purists will even claim this was his idea. I do want to note that, yes, the Sith returning did come from before Phantom Menace, and so EU purists might say this is not a valid reason to slam the EU, calling it low-hanging fruit. However, George still went against it with the prequel trilogy when he didn't need to, and on top of that, the EU continued to tell stories about the Sith post-Phantom Menace, even though the films established a Chosen One prophecy. I could give more respect to the EU and more of a pass had they backed away from the Sith after the Phantom Menace, but they didn't. Also, While the EU showed dark side spirits still alive after death, George has maintained that this was a light side concept only. In fact, Dave Filoni, for what it's worth, brings up that this is why Darth Bane and Darth Revan were cut from an episode of TCW, even though there is a pre-animated deleted scene of this, because ultimately George said that ran contrary to the Force and they should cut it out, even though he and the crew did like it. The Yin Kori and the Yuzan Vong, I hope I'm saying those right, have been established as being outside the Force, even though Kenobi said the Force goes through all life in A New Hope. Even if George did approve this, in The Phantom Menace he doubled down and had Qui-Gon establish that without the midi-chlorians, which is the powerhouse for the Force, that life could not be possible. Some may feel that this is not necessarily a retcon, but that's not how the EU author saw it, as James Luceno recalled having to grapple with this and reconcile it in New Jedi Order. We began to wrestle with the idea of making the Vong immune to the Force, given that we were dealing with the Phantom Menace's new revelations about the Force, as well as with an extragalactic species against whom the Force couldn't be used. There were many discussions about the Force, right up to the end of the series. Ki-Adi-Mundi in the EU was married and had wives, but this goes against the Jedi Code and makes the center plot of Attack of the Clones and especially Revenge of the Sith somewhat awkward. Doubly so for the fact that Ki-Adi-Mundi was also a knight on the Council initially, and this serves as one of Anakin's reasons for distrusting the Jedi and eventually joining Palpatine when they reject him becoming a master, but being on the Council, deliberately saying it's never been done before in the history of the Order, and he found it insulting. While some sources say George Lucas approved this, if he really did, then why did he go back on that and retcon this with the later prequel films? He should have stuck to his guns and not written no marriage or no knights on the Council into the films. Anakin would have known this too, since Mundi was a knight on the Council during Phantom Menace, according to EU material. But he felt no issue with retconning it because he didn't see it as part of his canon. Simple as that. While several of these issues did get cleared up in future EU reference books or stories, they still initially were retcons. Some EU purists like to say that because these retcons later got cleaned up, they are not actually retcons. This fundamentally misunderstands the logic behind this to begin with. The retcons only needed to be fixed because they were retconned to begin with, all from George Lucas. It's like the same logic that the EU only had to be decanonized because Lucasfilm Licensing considered it canon to begin with. Had he truly felt the EU was in the same canon as the films, he would not have made these retcons to begin with. And the fact that he does so shows he didn't indeed see it as a separate continuity, which he has personally stated several times, and as we've shown, others around the brand have known this as well. Some fans like to point to the various references or connections in the films to say George clearly saw them as canon. Let's go through some of them to show why that was not the case. First off, I could point out that a lot of EU purists like to point out that Disney doesn't even count their books as canon since they get retconned, but there are also just as many instances of Disney on-screen projects referencing their books, the most notable being Cobb Vanth. Even Dave Filoni references the books, having Thrawn reference in the Ahsoka show that he met Anakin, an event from the books. Based off of the EU purist logic regarding George and the EU with his prequel trilogy retcons and references, they must now admit Disney still counts their books as canon, even Dave Filoni. Second off, just because George included something does not mean he sees it as his original source as canon. He threw E.T. and Phantom Menace as a reference to the film E.T. Does that mean it's canon? He references Indiana Jones in his Star Wars books, or works. Does that mean Indiana Jones is canon? Tatooine is the name of a town in Tunisia where the desert scenes from A New Hope were filmed. That's why he named it Tatooine. Is that town canon? Some may respond to these points by saying this is different because those are different IPs in the real world. Is it though? Lucas rarely draws on his own concept art. He has other people draw designs and he uses what he likes. Most of those instances are no different. If Lucas accepts a piece of concept art, does that mean the original intention behind the piece is now canon? For example, the Magna Guard design was originally a design for Grievous. Does that mean canonically those are also Grievous because that was the original source and since Lucas used it, it's canon? Lucas was going to use Darth Talon in his sequel trilogy. We'll address this later. But mainly because he liked her design. Does that mean he saw the comics with Talon as canon? Most likely not, since using her in the sequel trilogy would have placed her about 100 years earlier in the timeline than she should have been. George has previously called the EU full of creativity, and he loves creativity. So he simply saw designs and elements that he thought were cool and included them. We've already brought up quotes from the EU, participants, and officials at the company that said even though George would sometimes reference them occasionally or pull an element in, it didn't mean he saw it as canon, and they knew that. With all that being said, let's dive in. Perhaps the biggest example is Aayla Secura. She was a character from the Republic comics that George included in Attack of the Clones. EU purists believe her inclusion means he saw her in the comics as canon. But in the commentary for Attack of the Clones, he doesn't call her Aayla Secura, he calls her a Twilight Jedi. He doesn't even know her name. Also, he needed a gazillion background Jedi. He said he saw the image of her on a comic and liked the design, so he threw her in, partially as a nod to the comics. Why did he need to nod to the comics if they were canon? He nods to Spielberg's films. None of this means she is canon or the comics are canon, other than the fact that she appears in the film and now she's canon through that medium. He simply needed Jedi and he liked the design. Also notice how he says he saw her design on the comic and threw her in. If he really saw the comics as canon, they should have been his first source for background Jedi, but instead a lot of them were original designs. Lucas used both a curved lightsaber handle and a double-bladed lightsaber, both of which have been used in EU comics prior to the prequel trilogy. Okay, he liked the designs and he thought they were cool and he used them. It's simple as that. This doesn't mean the comics themselves were canon. The same logic can be used for various things like the inclusion of Thielins, etc. There are also things that appear in both Shadows of the Empire and the special editions, like Sentinel landing ships, swoop bikes, and the Outrider. Both of these were in development at the same time. It's very possible ILM included them in the special edition first and they were used in Shadows of the Empire later. It's also very possible that in a money and time-saving strategy, assets from Shadows of the Empire were simply repurposed into the special edition. Their inclusion does not mean that George saw it as canon, and even so, it's possible these didn't even come from George and that the ILM guys stuck it in there. This also goes for the use of the Action 6 from the Thrawn Trilogy comics in the background of Attack of the Clones. Most likely an ILM guy stuck that in there. We know from ILM sources that the recent Light and Magic documentary that George left them to their own devices a lot of the time and mainly checked in and signed off on things. Important note that during a live stream with Rick Worley on YouTube on June 22nd, 2025, Mark Austin, who played Boba Fett in A New Hope, discussed at length for the first hour of the stream his role in the special editions. He was one of the special effects animators and worked on the Mos Eisley scenes. After having been involved in the work for a while, he was tapped to play Boba for a quick shoot scheduled for December 1994. According to the Secrets of the Shadows of the Empire book, the big meeting where everyone got together to work on crafting Shadows and its story was November 1994, when work on the Mos Eisley Special Edition sequences has already been ongoing. So, while I can't confirm it, it is very likely that the Shadows of the Empire references in A New Hope were actually A New Hope references in Shadows, and either repurposed assets or background designs that Shadows adopted. Speaking of Shadows, a fan has pointed out Prince Xizor is technically in Phantom Menace, as an action figure of him and a few other Shadows figurines were included in the pod racing audience seating from distant shots. To that I say, first off, ILM probably did that as they were the ones that made the set, not George. And second off, if canonically this means Xizor is in Phantom Menace, then we also need to account for the fact that canonically a bunch of painted Q-tips were present at the pod race, since in the wide shots that include Xizor, that's what the audience was made up of. Su Choi, I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly, a comic character, was seen in a Blink or You'll Miss It cameo in Revenge of the Sith on one of the Wookiee ships. This one was very likely just ILM. I've used ILM as a scapegoat a few times, and some have tried to suggest that George knew every pixel of these movies and would be aware of EU references, so he clearly accepted it. But I disagree. First off, the making of the EU movie showed George let the special effects people have a lot of freedom and personal oversight over the special effects. He wasn't super involved in the minutiae of it, just approving it. On top of that, George has literally said he doesn't keep up with the EU and has to use encyclopedias to keep up with the basic ideas and concepts. So even if he knows every pixel of the film, he's not going to know every tiny EU reference. He's not going to see a random speeder bike and go, oh yeah, that's from the EU. He's just going to go, oh cool, speeder bike design, I like it. Or something along those lines, assuming he even says anything at all. The pod racers in Episode 1 move similar to the way they do in the game. Well, the game is based on Episode 1, so that probably explains why. Also, footage from Pod Racer appears in Attack of the Clones on the background screens in the Coruscant Cantina. Like, okay? It's not a big deal. Why make something new when ILM could just take the game footage that looks similar to what they need it to look like and throw it in? That doesn't mean it's canon, and it might not even be from Lucas either. There are also various names that Lucas uses as species for film characters or personally references that seem to have their first mentions in the EU material, such as Rodian, Tung, Moon, Huts being a species, not a title, Aldera, and Rishi. Again, George thumbed through encyclopedias and probably liked the names, so he used them. I would also say that some of these may have simply been EU connections and visual guides after the fact, as I believe Toon and Moon were first from novels, not comics. George also has to make up a big universe with thousands of species, and he uses what he can. After all, Gungan came from his 2-year-old. As for Rhodians, and especially Hutts, George also has a vivid imagination of his own and came up with stuff by himself. If you look at interviews he did after A New Hope about some of the characters, most of which can be found in the Making of Star Wars by J.W. Rinsler, he had a lot of backstory and ideas and world building he would reveal about the world, much of which still ended up being true, like C-3PO being built by a child. So it's very possible these ones came from him and just appeared in EU sources first based off of notes the EU team had access to. Some references, like the use of the Juggernaut or the term Jedi Code, can be sourced back to original concept art or drafts of the classic films, though Jedi Code was originally called Jedi Oath. An EU source called it Code, and the code better fits its use in the prequels anyway, so this change on Lucas's end is probably intentional and a coincidence with the EU. Datapads appear in the EU, then pop up in the Phantom Menace. Yeah, it's a fictional, futuristic universe. They already had computer screens similar to datapads in the classic trilogy. A mobile version of this also existing makes sense to me. George needed something for them to watch the pod race on. This was most likely George figuring that out and is pure coincidence. Dooku uses a Force grip on Kenobi in Revenge of the Sith that also appeared in a game. Okay. George also needed a way to have Dooku remove Kenobi but not kill him so Anakin could kill Dooku without Obi-Wan interfering. Coincidence? This also most likely would have come from the stunt coordinator and choreographer Nick Gillard, not George. There are also several references to droids. Most of these are simply, again, names George liked. After all, none are used in the same manner as they were in the series. But also keep in mind, Ben Burt was a major part of droids, and so many references may have come from him, especially the fact that his minor cameo in Phantom Menace shares a surname to a droid's character that was probably something either he or visual guide writers did. Some characters from the EU books appear in the movies, like Salperin or Olana. These were after-the-fact retcons with extra background characters by StarWars.com. Not George. The line, "This war represents a failure to listen," was said by a character in a comic, and later used in Revenge of the Sith. Okay, George probably read the comic and liked the line and threw it in there. That doesn't mean it's canon. There are similar plot beats in Star Wars compared to Hidden Fortress. Are those canon? The opening crawl comes from Flash Gordon. Is that canon? George also pulled a line from President Bush and gave it to Obi-Wan in Revenge of the Sith. So, is Bush now canon to Star Wars? Plo Koon's fighter design is similar to Anakin's from the O3 Clone Wars. It's very possible Anakin's fighter was based off of Plo Koon's, as the O3 team had access to that stuff, or it was done by ILM. Either way, it doesn't make it canon per se, it's just simply a cool design that got included. Quinlan got referenced in Revenge of the Sith and was going to be included. First off, Quinlan first appeared in Phantom Menace. Second off, it's a character George likes, so he was going to include him in Revenge of the Sith. The scene got removed, but the reference was included instead. That doesn't mean he sees the whole character story and the comics as canon. He just liked the character and wanted to bring him into the film world because he liked him so much. Just like the designs of Ayla and something like that again. EU contributors and overseers have already commented on. Let's talk about one that pops up a lot. Let's talk about Coruscant. Coruscant is the name for the capital, even though George originally had Abaddon in Return of the Jedi script. This means it's canon, right? The whole EU? No. Let's take a look at the history behind Coruscant. According to Timothy Zahn, apparently when it came time to choose a name for the films, people persuaded George to go with Coruscant and be done with it. So I felt very vindicated. The tail wagging dog. It was an honor to be slipped into the movies this way. Steve Sansweet shed further light on the matter, saying, "The idea of a city-covered planet was in the early drafts of original trilogy scripts, but George Lucas wasn't able to get it onto the big screen until the prequels. Many scenes in Return of the Jedi were originally going to take place on the city planet, but as the script evolved, they were later relocated to the second Death Star. In these early drafts, the planet was called Had Abaddon. The name Coruscant came from author Timothy Zahn for his 1991 novel, Heir to the Empire. It's actually a real word that means glittering or giving forth flashes of light. When it came time to name the city planet for Episode 1, after considering several other names, Lucas decided to go with the already established Coruscant. So, Lucas had to be talked into doing it, and initially it wasn't his go-to. it was all canon to him, Coruscant should have been the go-to, no questions asked. But wait, Coruscant's industrial sector looks similar to how it is in a game, except that was depicted as Coruscant in general, not the industrial sector, and the building in the game was the Imperial Palace, not some random industrial building. But wait, Coruscant nightlife look in Attack of the Clones came from the EU, which in turn came from Ralph McQuarrie concept art. Also, in the Thrawn trilogy, Coruscant had visible mountains. That's not the case in the prequels. Not the slam dunk purist thought now, huh? But wait! Luminara and Barriss were in Attack of the Clones, and they were first in an EU novel in 2001. Aha, gotcha! Except, filming for Attack of the Clones was in mid-2000, so they were included as tie-in content leading into the new movie. Along the same line of thought, a lot of people like to point to Labyrinth of Evil as George counting the EU as canon since it's referenced in Revenge of the Sith. Except, with all tie-in material, that's not exactly the case. George wrote Revenge of the Sith, and as a marketing tie-in, he gave James Luceno the basics of the story and told him to write a book about it. So no, it wasn't Lucas referencing EU material, it was an EU material expanding on and revealing a window into a story from George. The Cato Nemoidia line? It was already there, and Luceno incorporated it. The same could be said about the Battle of Coruscant in the 03 series, though the depiction there is somewhat ignored in Revenge of the Sith, as there is no evidence of a ground battle in the film. Moral of the story, if George valued the EU as part of his canon, he wouldn't have retconned it to begin with, and a few references being included don't make up for the retconning of story beats and character backstories, especially when the references are not that great of proof on their own as well. You can't say George referenced EU, therefore it's canon, and then ignore when he blatantly retconned it. But we've only been dipping our toes into the water. Let's jump into the pool. Let's talk about the Clone Wars. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them delight.